Everybody. Good morning. Okay, it is so great to see you here today. A Friday morning in August in Washington, D.C. This is always a challenge, but it's great to see a group of people here who are interested in learning more about exam schools. My name is Mike Petrilli. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. For those of you who don't know too much about us, we are one of the nation's premier education policy think tanks operating out of D.C. What you may not know is that we also do on-the-ground work in Ohio. That's where our roots are. That's where Thomas B. Fordham was from, Dayton, Ohio, to be exact. We do things like sponsor charter schools in Dayton and around other cities in Ohio. We do work at the state level in Columbus. We're increasingly involved in some interesting things happening in Cleveland. And so we have this unique perspective of both a national think tank, but also doing work at the state level and local level. And that helps, we hope, to keep us somewhat grounded in reality. Speaking of reality, we have a great book to present to you today by Chester Finn and Jessica Hockett called, yes, thank you, Checker, Exam Schools. And we're going to talk about the reality of exam schools like School Without Walls and Thomas Jefferson here in the D.C. area. Now, for those of you who are online, we do invite you to join the discussion. We're always happy to have people tune in from around the country. You can send your questions to questions@edexcellence.net, and later on in a little bit we'll get to audience questions and questions from online. So again, questions@edexcellence.net, and on Twitter use the hashtag #examschools. Okay. If you see me with my iPhone up here, it's only because I'm tweeting from the podium, which I have to admit I did once before at an event. Checker will probably not allow me to do that for this one. Okay, but it's kind of fun to moderate and tweet at the same time. Let me say a few words about Fordham's interest in this topic, and then I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel, and we'll get started. Fordham, we do work in a variety of areas. Some of the big issues we're covering right now include Common Core, the implementation of school choice in all of its various forms, doing more with less, rethinking education governance. But one issue that's been near and dear to our heart for the past 5 years or so has been focusing on the performance of our high-achieving students. Now, this isn't because we don't worry about the performance of our low-achieving students. Any look at NAEP data or international data will tell you that we still have, even 10 years after No Child Left Behind, a huge crisis when it comes to our lowest-performing students. And closing achievement gaps and focusing on leaving No Child Left Behind, that is still a huge priority for us and for the country. At the same time, however, we have been concerned that with all the focus on raising the achievement of the lowest performers, there has not been enough attention on the high performers. And in fact, we have policies in place today, we worry, that are doing harm to high achievers, that are encouraging school systems to not pay much attention to them. Whereas school systems have all kinds of incentives today to get kids to basic levels of proficiency in reading and math, they do not have any incentives, at least from federal policy or in most cases state policy, to help high achievers make even more progress over time. And we generally think it's unfair that any child should come to school and not be challenged to fulfill their potential and to make progress over time. And yet we worry that that's what's happening with many of our highest achieving students. So we've done a variety of studies in the last several years looking at this question. And in fact, you do see evidence from NAEP, from student level data and others that the high achieving students in this country are stagnating. That when you look at the performance, there's been big gains at the bottom of the distribution and very mediocre gains, if any, at the top, and we think that's a problem. So it's in that context that we got interested in this issue of exam schools as one piece of the American education system that is focused very squarely on our highest achieving students. It's interesting from that perspective. It's also an interesting form of school choice, and as an organization that believes that parents should have choices and that schools should have the freedom to be different from one another, this was an area that we found to be very interesting. We believe in educational pluralism. We think that's very powerful when you allow schools to differentiate from one another rather than try to serve the needs of all students in a given geography. You can do some things that are quite innovative and promising. So that's the context for our conversation today. So our panel. First up is Chester E. Finn Jr. You know him as Checker. If you don't, now you do. He is the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and he is, of course, co-author of Exam Schools. He is also the chairman of the Hoover Institution's Correct Task Force on K-12 Education. He has written or co-authored something like 20 books now. So, it's not quite as prolific as Rick Hess, who authors 20 books in a given year. Yes, but still not so shabby. And, of course, my boss. But that does not mean that I will refrain from asking tough questions. Next up, we have Jessica Hockett, who is the other co-author of Exam Schools. Jessica earned her doctorate in educational psychology with an emphasis on gifted education at the University of Virginia and worked there as a research assistant at the National Research Center on the Gifted and Talented. University of Virginia is one of the key research centers focusing on this issue and has done fantastic work on all kinds of things. And now she's doing a variety of consulting. So really happy to have her here. Next, we have Jeffrey Jones, who has had a very distinguished career. Since July of 2000, he has been the head of the Potomac School in McLean. Perhaps most relevant, though, for today's conversation, he was the founding principal of Thomas Jefferson High School in Fairfax County, Virginia, which, according to many lists, is the best high school in the country. Yes. And the matter of much controversy as well.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that. And finally, Stephen Joel Trachtenberg, who is the president emeritus and university professor of public service at George Washington University, where he served as president from 1988 to 2007. And relevant to this conversation in particular is that he was very active in bringing School Without Walls to the George Washington campus. This is a selective school here in Washington, D.C., and we're going to talk about his experiences with that. You might notice that if those of you interested in public policy might also notice that the GW School of Public Policy is the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy. That's a good sign, and that's pretty good. Usually you have to give a lot of money in order to get that kind of recognition. And yes.
I didn't have any money. I gave them my life.
You gave them your life, yes. And I understand you were pretty good at raising money.
Some of that.
All right. Okay, with those introductions now, we're going to hear from Checker and Jessica giving us an overview of the book, and then we'll get into a conversation. So, welcome, Checker Fenton.
Thank you. When I'm not preoccupied supervising Mike, I occasionally get to write things, and in the project was joined by a terrific co-author in Jessica. And the project was a joint venture of Fordham and the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and ultimately also with the Princeton University Press, which did a really nice job on editing and publishing. If you're feeling deprived of copies, the copies only came into the Princeton University Press warehouse about 3 days ago, and even Amazon doesn't have its supply yet. But they're emerging from the press and available more or less now. We set out to find, list, and then visit and learn about a collection of schools that nobody's ever studied, as best we can tell, in the United States of America. And given how much studying of education goes on, it's astonishing, actually, that nobody's ever actually written this book before. We went out in search of the selective admission, academically focused public high schools of America. It was actually hard to find the list. There is a list of 165 schools at the back of the book. It is the first such list that's ever existed. It was all we could find in a country with more than 20,000 public high schools. But we did have use fairly rigorous criteria. It had to be a complete high school, not a program within another high school. It had to be academically focused. So schools for the arts, for example, are not on the list. It had to have selective admission using a variety of criteria, often including but not limited to exam tests of various kinds. There's really only a handful of schools, mostly in New York and Boston, that use only a test score and nothing but as their criterion for admission. Most of these schools turn out to be more like college admissions offices, a much more holistic approach to which kids get in, but there is always a minimum threshold of academic potential or achievement or test score that's part of the package. We scoured existing lists of every kind, including the Newsweek and Washington Post and U.S. News lists. We had access to the highest SAT score schools in the country. We went through all kinds of agonies to decide which schools actually met our criteria. And in the end, as I said, found 165 of them scattered across 30 states and D.C., meaning there are 20 states with none of these schools at all. There are a few places like New York and Chicago and Philadelphia with a lot of them. There are, as I just said, a lot of places with none of them. And there are a bunch of places that have one. Cincinnati, Ohio has the Walnut Hills High School. It's very important in Cincinnati, but if you don't live there, you may not have ever heard of it. You would, on the other hand, have heard of Thomas Jefferson and the Bronx High School of Science and Boston Latin and some of these nationally iconic schools that have been around, it seems like, forever. Though that's interesting, too. All these schools have different histories. In one case, going back to 1840, in Townsend and in Boston Latin case, going back to the 17th century. But half the schools that we were able to get data for came into being within the last 30 years. They are not ancient schools. They are relatively recent creations, sometimes of districts, sometimes of states, sometimes of universities, sometimes of eccentric individuals that persuaded the legislature that their state needed one of these. Some of them, a small number, are residential schools. Most of them have some affiliation with a school system or systems. The School Without Walls is affiliated with the D.C. Public Schools, for example. Thomas Jefferson, as Jeff can explain in endless complexity if he wants to, is managed by Fairfax County, but is actually a state school that is open to kids from multiple districts in Northern Virginia. Complicated structures in many cases. Besides making the list, which was in some ways our greatest accomplishment, we surveyed the principals. Got a pretty decent response rate on an elaborate survey. Jessica's going to go over some of the data that we got back, and we've been able to do some analysis that's yielded some pretty interesting and in some cases completely unexpected by us findings, such as the student demographics, which I'm sure she's going to talk about, which were different than what we thought we might find and what a lot of critics say. We also got into admissions procedures and staffing and a whole variety of things. So the third chapter of the book is full of data based on both hard data sources like the National Center for Education Statistics and also our survey results. And then we visited schools. We set out to visit a dozen of the schools in different parts of the country. In the end, thanks to airplane cancellations, we got to 11 of the 12. Mostly in April and May as they were preparing for AP tests. And a stressful time in a selective high school where an awful lot of kids are gunning to have 7 APs on their college application or something like that. And we each went to 5 or 6 schools separately and asked a lot of questions, sat in some classes, talked to a lot of people, often including parents and kids as well as teachers and administrators, and wrote up profiles of the 11 schools. So the whole middle section of the book are profiles of these 11 individual schools, including School Without Walls and TJ in this area. And I also got to go to Austin, Texas to visit the Liberal Arts and Science Academy, and I got to go to New York to visit Townsend Harris High School, the 1840 origins school in the middle of Queens that was shut down by Fiorello LaGuardia in 1942, allegedly because one of his relatives didn't get in, and was reborn in the 1980s by a combination of its loyal alumni who had never given up trying and the president of Queens College, who said, in essence, I'll help you bring your school back to life, but it's going to be in Queens, not Manhattan. So I got to visit that and a bunch of other schools. I thought and every single one of them turned out to be fascinating, but almost all of them in completely different ways. They had some important things in common, though. These are generally safe, focused, academically serious places where the kids are serious about studying, the teachers are serious about teaching, and pretty much everybody is bent on going to college, nearly always a 4-year college, and in many cases a selective admission college. So the culture of the school, and these are whole schools, let me remind you, these are not AP programs within schools. The culture of the school is generally one of serious study and serious learning. And that's pretty exhilarating to find in American public education high schools. The big question, and it's the policy issues we wrestle with at the end of the book, is would the country be better off with more of them? And Jessica and I are not total agreement on this. We think that the country would be better off with a lot more opportunities for able, highly motivated kids all over the country, starting in the elementary grades, not just at high school. Whether this kind of school should proliferate is a complicated question because there's downsides to it in communities. Just to give you an example of one downside, the challenge of creaming off the ablest, highest achieving kids from all the other high schools in order to go to this high school can create problems in the other high schools, such as, do they have enough kids left to justify their own AP courses? If a lot of their high ability kids move off into the selective admission high school. And of course, there are endless issues over the selectivity challenge itself and whether that's compatible with public education in America. I think it is. I think we think it is, as long as it's done in a responsible way. And that generally involves looking at factors besides a single test score. So it's called exam schools, and exams are nearly always part of the picture, but they are not the whole story in terms of who gets in. By the way, nearly everybody graduates, and nearly everybody does go to college. And with that bit of good news, I think Jessica's also going to share with you some of the things that were maybe questionable about this approach to education. Your turn.
Good morning. I'm going to highlight some of the more surprising things that we found, or some things that maybe gave us pause or raised some questions. One thing that people always ask and always wonder about academically selective public high schools is, are they representative, at least approximately, of the communities that they serve? What are the demographics like? Is it all rich white kids, for example, that end up going to these schools? And we were a little bit surprised to find that when we compared the demographics of students who attend all public schools with the demographics of students who attend academically selective schools, that certain groups are under or overrepresented that you might not expect. So, for example, and I apologize that I don't have a chart available for this right now. I think that's going to be made available online, and they're certainly available in the books. But for all public high schools, 56% of students are white. Among exam schools, 35% of students are white. African American students comprise 17% of the population in American high schools, and in exam schools they comprise 30%. Hispanic students in the broader population, 13%, and in exam schools, 20%, and in exam schools it's 13%. And then 5% of our high school students in public schools are Asian, and 21% are Asian in exam schools. When the story becomes a little bit more complex when you look at individual schools, however, particularly with African American students, we have a lot of schools in urban areas like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Milwaukee that are selective, but they might be less selective than some other schools in that city or in other cities. So in general, and that might account for the fact that there are more black students overall in exam schools. 70% of the schools on our list have student populations that consist of one race alone. So we saw a lot of that a lot of students that are black that are in these exam schools are in schools that are predominantly black. Going back to the example in the urban areas, we found, and I don't think we termed it this way in the book, but we found in urban areas schools like Brooklyn Technical that I would call maybe urban oases that keep students that or families that otherwise might leave an urban center for the suburbs or for private schools. They give them kind of an incentive to stay. And then we saw, but they don't have a lot of necessarily black and Hispanic students in them. Then we see schools that are pretty prevalent in places like Milwaukee that I would call urban refuges, where they're predominantly comprised of black and Hispanic students, and they're selective, but they're not high performing, and you're not necessarily going to find them on lists that are put out by Newsweek and the Washington Post and such. So that's one thing that we found. We also found that these schools don't necessarily have information on their effective Certainly, one complaint that people have when these lists of the best public high schools in America come out is, well, of course Thomas Jefferson is doing well. They get to choose who comes in the door. They don't serve just every kid who walks in or who lives in an attendance area. So of course we would expect them to do well on state assessments and AP exams and such. But within the schools themselves, when we ask them about how do you know that your kids are doing better than they might not have otherwise if they hadn't gone to the school? In other words, as one principal put it, how do you know that they're succeeding because of you instead of in spite of you? The schools didn't know. They said they don't really have that data. So on the one hand, the state assessments serve these schools well because they give them some freedom to maybe focus on other things other than the kids' performance on the test, because the kids are going to do okay. But insofar as measures for growth, they really don't have them. The other thing that's a little bit surprising is that these schools don't necessarily examine their admissions processes and whether they're working, whether they're reliable, whether they're valid, unless there's maybe a lawsuit that's brought forth. And actually, the schools, at least among those that Checker and I visited, that seem to have the most comprehensive and multifaceted and defensible admissions processes were some schools that had been provoked in some kind of way to examine that. But by and large, we found that schools did not really ask themselves, okay, do kids who do get in here do better than kids that we said no to? What kind of rigorous evidence do we have of that would make our processes a little bit more defensible? The last thing that we found that was, I think, somewhat surprising for us is that some of these schools, especially among those that we visited, were really more like whole school versions of the AP or honors track. That is, they weren't necessarily doing something differently than would be found in those classes in a comprehensive high school. Some, in fact, were. And if I can be so bold as to say, Thomas Jefferson, the kids were doing some things that were really exciting. That were really, you could say, all right, only kids, or primarily kids who are selected to this high school, could, would, or should be doing this. They're more appropriate for these kids. Other schools, we just said, this is just the whole school version of AP, and why do we need a separate school for this in particular? AP classes weren't necessarily created for gifted and talented kids per se, so we were left with some questions about that. So those are just some of the some of those issues that we found. Thanks very much.
One fact we should have added is that all of these schools have a lot more applicants than they can accommodate. The market signals are that more people would like to go to them, and anywhere from 2 times as many to 8 times as many applicants, most of them qualified on the minimum thresholds to come. So there is a demand that exceeds the supply, and that needs to be understood.
Yeah.
Let me take the moderator's option here to ask a few questions, and then we'll get to some comments. Checker and Jessica, I understand why you don't want to look at just traditional comprehensive high schools with AP programs, but why not look at places that had these sort of within-school magnets? So in the D.C. area, for example, Blair High School has a math and science magnet as well as a humanities magnet. Some people might compare the math and science magnet to Thomas Jefferson. Why not look at those as well?
It's a fair separate study. You would get into complicated definitional problems as to when is this a program within the school and when is it just 7 AP courses that anybody can take. What constitutes the school within a school? So we went looking for whole schools. If you went looking for schools within schools and could define it, you'd find hundreds more of those kinds of programs. But it'd be hard to define the boundaries.
Mm-hmm. And then this question that you raise about the creaming, and we'll definitely talk about this. This seems to be one of the biggest complaints people have. I mean, I like the way, Jessica, you describe these different kinds of schools, the Oasis versus the Refuge. I mean, do you think it plays out differently for those different kinds of schools? In other words, is it even a bigger problem, let's say, for Milwaukee, that you've got some of these selective schools that they're not necessarily high performing? You look at their test scores, and compared to the state of Wisconsin as a whole, they're not great, but they're pretty good compared to the rest of Milwaukee. I mean, is that... There you're really skimming kids who otherwise would have been in traditional schools. The Oasis schools, I guess the kids may have moved, or you think they would have gone to the suburbs. I mean, how do you think about that in terms of the creaming issue?
I mean, for me, I think about it, I think it's more of an issue where there is an exam school that's serving a district, so it's a little bit smaller, versus a school that's serving a region or multiple districts or an entire state. So Illinois Math and Science Academy, for example, it would be hard for somebody to accuse the school of creaming because there are, I think, only 600 kids that go there, and they're drawn from across the state. Whereas Oxford Academy, another school that we profiled in the book, it's one of, I'm not going to remember how many, but I think 8 or 10 high schools in Anaheim. And even though the district, I'm not going to get these numbers exactly right, but is less than 20% Asian, the Oxford Academy is something like 70% Asian, and all the highest performing kids are also going there. So I could see that argument definitely more for a school that's serving in a district than I could a broader area.
Several of the schools I visited actually had entered into what I'm going to call treaties with the other high schools in the area, not to take more than X of the students from that high school or from the district served by that high school. When Townsend Harris High School, just to give one example, was reborn in Queens, the principals of Bayside High School and several of the other kind of upper middle class public high schools in New York were very nervous that all their best kids were going to go to Townsend Harris, and so essentially they entered into a treaty that they would take no more than this many kids from this part of Queens and this many kids from this part of Queens in order to avoid this huge anxiety. It's a political challenge about creaming from all over the borough.
One more point that comes to mind is I believe it's Maggie Walker in Virginia, which is a governor's school here. Those students take the state test, and their scores are actually reported back to their home schools. So that's a treaty of sorts as well, so that those schools gets credit and gets to count those kids in their school report card data. So at least at that school.
Very interesting. Okay, well, let's hear from two people very involved in starting some of these schools or helping them with new lives. So, Jeff, why don't we get started with you, with Thomas Jefferson. Tell us about your thoughts on the book and whether it rings true for your experiences.
Well, I've had an opportunity to read the book. Thankfully, I've got an advanced copy, and I'm very much believe that this is an important study, that many of the things that Checker and Jessica already talked about, are absolutely critical to the work we were doing at Jefferson for Imagine. Let me start with just that question about the complete school piece. It was essential for us from the beginning to think of ourselves as a whole school and to be able to look across the curriculum to think about how we were going to introduce science and technology in a different way than might have been true at Bronx or Stuyvesant, where the emphasis was largely on how do you make the science and the technology and the mathematics more rigorous and stronger. We were clearly looking at something larger in the way of how science and technology is essential and critical in our development of industry, of culture, of just enhancing our lives in every aspect. And so the idea of looking at social studies and language arts in the context of what's it mean to understand science and technology better and to be a better user of that knowledge and information in every aspect of your work was really important to us. And so that complete school piece meant for us that we created cross-disciplinary teams that looked at every assignment that was being developed throughout the curriculum, that made it possible for us to work in an outreach effort, actually, as we looked to this admissions process and problem, if you will, of the demographics, to be certain that we were communicating clearly through the system, K through 12, what the expectations would be and what the challenges would be for attending a school like Thomas Jefferson, and developed a number of outreach programs to the lower grades, to elementary students and middle school students. Much of that sponsored actually by the community. In many cases it was foundation money. Alfred P. Sloan Foundation supported outreach programs to the minority populations. The National Endowment for the Humanities supported the professional development for faculty to be able to create the interdisciplinary kind of models that we were trying to develop. And of course, we had a lot of partnerships with universities in the area and broadly. They're all interested in your students in the end. And so those were good connections for us to make, both for our future, for our students, but also development of the school. Jessica was at UVA as a doctoral student. We actually did 2 consecutive studies with doctoral students at UVA to try and understand this value-added piece because of UVA's work in gifted education. It's true, you're not going to look at the test scores. We knew those coming in. And so what were we trying to do? And for us, this wholeness piece had several important aspects, and it's worth looking at. Frankly, I left Thomas Jefferson after 12 years to go to a K-12 school because one of the things we learned in bringing students in at 9th grade was, particularly talented students, they'd already sort of developed a learning modality that was almost contrary 180 degrees to what we were going to ask them to do. They had been in the gifted tracks and doing really well on tests. They came to us as the best test takers in Northern Virginia. And that was their learning modality. And so I went back to a K-12 independent school where you could really work with children from the time you meet them as a 4 or 5-year-old to really focus on what are the skill sets that you're going to be trying to develop to really support able and talented learners. And there's nothing surprising about them. And even though science and tech was our focus at Jefferson, where we were working with these students was around developing really powerful communication skills, learning to work collaboratively in teams, thinking in terms of systems rather than the kind of linear model we follow in education more typically, giving them real hands-on experiential opportunities in mentorship experiences, recognizing that throughout their life they're going to be mentoring others and being mentored at the same time, and giving them real experience in problem finding, problem solving, and of course a huge focus on ethical culture and really understanding the social emotional aspects of learning and work and growth. And so you'd find those in almost any great school, and they are the traditional sort of goals and values we've had in education. But there were problems, of course, and there continue to be problems in developing these kinds of schools. The scale is an important one, and it would be difficult to do on a small scale. It's much better. We know that about high schools in general. The research for a long time has said high schools need to have 600 or more students in them to really be a good comprehensive school. And I would suggest that to do the kind of work we're trying to do in these kinds of programs, you need to be larger still in some way. And so that scale issue works for you in some districts and against you in others. We had the advantage, of course, of being a regional school at Jefferson, and that meant that there would be 40 to 50,000 students who there was a possibility of working with. And yet you still have the selection process, which is a very political process. Jessica, we did, in fact, look at that selection process time and time again to tweak it. First of all, to just find out if we were bringing the kind of students we wanted to. We thought spatial learning would be important if we were going to do a lot of hands-on experiential kind of development. And we just couldn't make any connection in the testing. And maybe the testing was at fault, but it fell out that it didn't make much difference what that test told us about spatial learning. But the real issue, of course, was the demographics of the selectivity. And that is a challenge beyond simply the admissions test. We lived in Northern Virginia, and the demographics of Northern Virginia are selective to begin with. You have to have enough wealth to be able to move into that community. You move into that community because it has good schools. And so there would be that opportunity to have a great education at any number of 10 to 15 good public schools across Northern Virginia and in the participating jurisdictions. And so would students choose to travel to come to another school? Would they come to a school that didn't have in their mind the neighborhood advantage of all their friends are with them as they go to school and those kinds of things? And so the demographics of who shows up at these schools are much more complex than just a relationship to the test. But
Okay, great. Thank you. So many more things to talk about. Be ready for some questions afterwards.
Sure.
Okay, great. Okay, Steve, tell us about School Without Walls.
Well, first of all, I don't want to take too much credit for School Without Walls. It actually existed even before I came to Washington, and 30 years ago. But it was being conducted in a building which said over the mantle Grant School, and which I am led to believe was named after General Grant sometime during or immediately after the Civil War. It was said that Mrs. Roosevelt had visited the school while her husband was in the White House, and that she commented on the decrepitude of the facility at the time, and nobody had done anything about it subsequently. So when I arrived in Foggy Bottom, and GW had overflowing classes, and we were using some of the School Without Walls facilities at night for some of our sections, I took the opportunity to walk through the school, and I was on the third floor and needing a washroom, asked for it, and was told that, well, the ones on the third floor and the second floor were closed because they were in disrepair, and so I'd have to go down to the basement to use a bathroom, and be careful. By the way, the ceiling was falling down in this particular corridor, so I probably ought to duck around to protect myself. I thought this seems to me a disgrace and a problem. We had this school that everybody was proud of, but nobody was willing to put any capital investment in, and it came to pass, as it often does with GW, that a real estate opportunity presented itself. And I saw an opportunity to solve several problems at the same time. We were being pressured by, the university was being pressured by community members to house more of our undergraduates in university facilities rather than have them integrated into the population, where apparently they were too lively, and occasionally used flower pots as urinals, and so which for reasons I don't completely understand, because I'm told that this is true at the Bohemian Grove, which is a very famous and distinguished place.
Redwood trees, not flower pots.
Yes, well, you have to accommodate for urban environment, but at any rate, so we saw an opportunity to build additional housing on what was the parking lot of the School Without Walls. The problem was that would leave the School Without Walls without parking, and the faculty objected to that. And so what we suggested was that the city would sell us the parking lot. We would build this student housing on the parking lot. It would have underground parking. The faculty would get parking in the underground parking, and that would be even better than the outdoor parking, which they then had, because it would be weather protected. That arrangement would go on in perpetuity, and moreover, the university would give cash to the district public schools to renovate the School Without Walls facility, and they ultimately, and it took several years to persuade them to the virtue of this, they ultimately did it, and did it enthusiastically, or at least they put some money in, which I take as a sign of enthusiasm, and used our money plus taxpayer money to build what can only be described of as an absolute state-of-the-art, wonderful facility. During the negotiation, I took the opportunity to introduce academic considerations as well as the monetary and commercial ones, and so we developed an arrangement by which School Without Walls high school students could come to GW and take courses at GW. Moreover, the School Without Walls has no athletic facilities, and so those students could use our athletic facilities. They also could use, then the faculty as well, our computer networking system and our university library. But most interestingly, and believe me, I steal from every place I can, and so Jefferson and Bronx High School of Science and Hunter High School and Lab School at the University of Chicago were the source of many of the ideas. But one of the ideas that I came up with was that the very best of the School Without Walls youngsters would be permitted to get associate degrees from GW upon graduation, concurrently with their high school diplomas, and so they could, at that point, either enter GW as juniors or as freshmen, depending on what they wanted. And I always advocated they start as freshmen, but if they were wanting to accelerate and thought that was best for them, they could. Or they could go to other universities entering as juniors, or they go to other universities entering as freshmen. In any case, they came away with an associate's degree immediately upon graduation. And so that pepped the whole thing up. I think a lot of the credit, by the way, has to go to the principal, Mr. Trogish, who had the vision and the imagination and the energy to make all this happen. So, but I am pleased that we built the housing and we got a better school for the city, and so it really was a win-win win. About the book, I had the opportunity to read the book in galleys. I had been invited by Princeton University Press to read the book even before they made the decision to publish it, and was asked whether I thought this was a book that ought to be published, and took the opportunity to
Usually you never find out who your peer reviewers are.
Thank you.
It's exciting. We've broken news here today. All right.
Well, there you go. There you go. For whatever it's worth, I subsequently sent a book of my own to Princeton, and they said no. So there you have it. You know, they trust my judgment when it comes to Checker's books and Jessica's books, but they don't trust my own book. I had to settle. It's not fair to them. The Johns Hopkins University Press. Any rate, I said, when I read the book, I said, "My God, good news!" For those of us who have been involved with education for me, 50, well, since kindergarten, of course, but for the last 50 years of my professional life, I'm always on the edge of despair that there's never going to be good news, you know, or every time there is good news, it's immediately snatched away because it turns out, you know, like Lance Armstrong, somebody was cheating, and so I almost don't trust any of the data that comes out if it's positive. And so to have a book that says there are answers and it is possible to have public schools that are affirmative and that work and that maybe have models for others, it seemed to me it was very important document to be published and to be distributed. Now I must say, having said that, I thought back to my own youth in the New York City public schools, and I couldn't help but remember, as you say, the Bronx High School of Science and Brooklyn Tech and Stuyvesant and Hunter High School, and then if you want to be a little artsy craftsy, music and art and professional school, and there was always the lab school at Chicago, and not always, but and most significantly, perhaps at the cap end of the thing, was the New York State Regents exams, which it seemed to me provided a certain recipe for what was going on in all the schools around the state. You could take Regents exams in things that were designed for inner city and suburban and rural. I myself took agriculture to find what I thought was going to be an easy course in my senior year, and we had to plant corn and other things on the football field behind James Madison High School, and my corn died, and I almost flunked the course, which could have been a problem.
By the way, is this what you wrote about in your book?
My book.
It was not about. It was on a memoir, including the corn stories.
Well, I have a memoir, but
right.
that's Simon and Schuster, and you can get it used. For any place from a dime to a quarter on Amazon these days, if you get a used copy. No, the new book is called Why They Fail, and it's a look at university presidents who crash and burn within 2 years after their appointment. in 2 or 3 years, and you have to ask yourself, what happened? You know, a search committee searches for a year, and they interview 400 people, and they narrow it down. They hire a president. The person shows up, and you know, burns out, goes off the rails within a year or 2 or 3, and you say, could that have been anticipated and saved a lot of pain for the school and for the individual? So that's what that book is about.
Well, let's wrap this up and then we're going to get into some questions in just a minute. So.
Just one point. I have a cousin who graduated from Stuyvesant High School in New York, a very competitive exam school, and went on to the University of Chicago, a school that is so severe, so academically focused that it is reputed to be the place where fun goes to die. And
I spent 10 years of my life there.
Well, there you go.
I'm still alive.
How did it go for you?
I love it.
There you go. Well, at any rate, and so he goes off to the University of Chicago, and I get to be talking with him, and I say, is the University of Chicago as severe, as competitive as it's supposed to be? And he said, well, no. He said, compared to Stuyvesant, it's easy. And I say, and how do you explain that? And he said, well, you know, they have fewer Asian students. And so he concluded on the basis of this ethnic test that Chicago didn't compete with Stuyvesant High School in New York. That said, he graduated in the middle of his class, so it may not have been as easy as he thought. I'm concluded. Thank you.
One anecdote, because this is relevant to the schools in general, but also Stuyvesant. There's been a whole lot of news in New York the last couple months about cheating scandal at Stuyvesant. I think the principal finally had to quit as a consequence of it. Cheating turns out to be the only discipline problem that these exam schools encounter. They don't encounter gang violence, people bringing guns to school, people attacking each other. They don't encounter kids missing school. The only thing is they have these super competitive kids and who want to get ahead and have pretty sharp elbows, including with each other. And so cheating and other forms of sort of academic dishonesty turned out to be, at least in the places we visited, the only discipline problem.
And a number of the schools do screen for behavior as well, or they consider that in the admissions process. Not all, but there were a number that did.
All right, well, good. Well, thank you for the comments, provocative and entertaining at the same time. Let's ask, first of all, the big question here, kind of almost a moral question, which is our school systems are facing very tough times financially, huge fiscal strain. A lot of us think it's going to last even once the recession is over for good and unemployment goes back down, that we're looking at structural changes. We've got baby boomers retiring, et cetera. So, the public school system is going to be under great financial distress maybe for 10 or 20 years. And the question is, what is the argument for spending public money on schools like these for kids who are probably going to do fine anyway, when we could be spending those dollars helping kids who, it's really a matter of life or death whether or not we improve their achievement. So I'd be curious from any of you, who wants to tackle that first?
I'm not persuaded that these schools will have to be more expensive than normative schools, and even if they are, it's a marginal difference, and so the spread is not from 0 to 100; it's from what you would be spending in any case, and maybe a little extra beyond that. Our society is legally obliged to provide educational opportunities, frequently at great expense, for youngsters with educational handicaps of one sort or another, learning disadvantaged. Surely being blessed with extra capacity is one form of disadvantage in our society. I think the parents of actual geniuses frequently regret that their children have that aptitude and wish they were more normal, because it is not easy, I think, to be distinguishable in that manner. And so I would argue that just as we have an obligation to do all we can for youngsters with disadvantage, we have academic disadvantage, learning disabilities, we have an obligation both to the individual students, but also to our own society to compensate on the other end of that extreme.
Jeff?
I think the book actually does a pretty good job of pointing out that most of these schools are not spending dramatically much more money than is true in the neighborhood public school. And in fact, in many cases, they're finding economies of scale that work for them rather than against them, and also find a lot of resource support externally from the normal channels of public funding of education. And true at Jefferson, that much of our work was done sponsored by business and industry and through works with foundations, as I mentioned, and in some money coming from the state system, but we had an obligation to the state and ran training programs for teachers from throughout the state of Virginia, for example, as a part of that exchange, if you will, as a governor's regional school. And so the politics sort of work out that you really don't find there's much more public money in support of these programs.
There are a couple of macro investment aspects to this that I think go belong beyond the public education budget. There is the national competitiveness investment in people who ought to be educated to the max if you want them to be inventors to the max or leaders to the max. And help with things like international competitiveness. There's also a local investment aspect to this. Some of these schools serve as magnets for business and industry to come to their community.
Absolutely.
Some of them serve as magnets for middle and upper middle class families to stay in the city, to stay in public education, paying the taxes that pay for the school budget, such as it is. There are these collateral benefits of schools like this and of the investment in them that need to be considered in a kind of larger macro sense.
All right, let's talk about the diversity issue, because that's another big one that gets raised. Right now, Thomas Jefferson is facing several complaints. One from teachers saying that the admissions requirements have been softened too much in an effort to promote a kind of form of affirmative action, and that therefore the kids coming in are not as strong as they used to be. On the flip side, you've got a lawsuit out there now saying that there's not enough being done on the pipeline to make sure that African American and Latino students, low-income students in Fairfax County and around have opportunities to enter gifted and talented programs from an early age, and that if you don't get into those programs when you're very little, you're not going to have a shot at making it all the way to TJ. Let's focus maybe on the latter part of that question. So what are these schools worried about the pipeline? Are they doing anything? I mean, colleges in the old way of thinking about affirmative action was they would affirmatively go out there and think about their pipelines. Are these schools doing that too? Is there anything working that could be emulated?
They're doing a lot of outreach to try to identify kids and feeder schools and persuade guidance counselors and teachers and so forth of their existence. These schools don't control their pipelines. They don't control who gets into the applicant pool or how well prepared those kids were in the primary and middle grades. I'd say because they can't do much about the kids who apply, they set out with outreach mechanisms to make sure that everybody who could conceivably apply and benefit from the school at least knows about it and why they might want to consider it, including reaching into minority and poor neighborhoods to make sure that the counselors there are telling the able kids in those schools about the existence of these high schools.
Sure, we ran summer enrichment programs every summer for 6th, 7th, and 8th graders to bring them to the school, help them become familiar with the kind of work that they could be doing if they came to the school. And to support them, half a day was enrichment and half a day was skill set development and really helping prepare them for the kind of rigorous application process that they were facing if they wanted to apply.
Steve, you know, I should put a plug in for my own book coming out in November. That's about, since we're all doing it, on diverse schools and gentrification and other issues. And when I was reporting for that, I heard from the School Without Walls, people were talking about a couple of years ago the so-called Caucasian invasion, that suddenly, that white students were suddenly surging into the applicant pool, and that was something, some big demographic shifts at the school recently, perhaps again because of the gentrification that's happened in D.C., on Capitol Hill and other places. Many more white families sending their kids to elementary and middle schools in D.C. public schools, and then looking for options in high school. Have you seen those demographic shifts, and do you know, what is the school thinking about that? How is it thinking through these kinds of issues? Again, to make sure that this is an opportunity for all the kids in D.C.
Well, the School Without Walls is not a neighborhood school. It's a citywide school, right, and reaches out into all the wards of the District of Columbia. Now, that's partly a political decision that they made in order to encourage the D.C. The City Council and the school board to permit the school to be renovated and to invest in it. But frankly, if you have a resource like that in a small city, this is actually, I mean, a relatively discrete geographic region. It'd be foolish not to reach out to the entire community, because that's how you're going to get the very best students. But you know, again, I tend to think you have to get students of all genders and races and the whole panoply of the human condition, partly to be able to call yourself a selective and outstanding high school. We are not ultimately in our high schools or our colleges preparing people to live in communities in which they're gated in communities of geniuses. We're preparing them to go out and live their lives in a greater society, and they're going to discover in a greater society people of varied capacities and races and religions. And so in order to anticipate that, I think you have to bring them up in that environment.
There were two other specific things going on in this situation. One, of course, was the economic recession, causing a fair number of families to decide that private school was not affordable anymore. But also, D.C., I think, closed Woodrow Wilson High School to renovate it. And this is the other public high school in town that is most apt to appeal to Caucasian families.
Another thing I think is worth mentioning, one of the administrators that I spoke with said, you know, we can only consider for admission those kids that apply. And there are a lot of things besides, or in addition to preparation from elementary and middle school that influence that, including just practical things like geography. Can you even get there? I don't think it's a coincidence that the most racially balanced selective high school in Chicago is also the most accessible and the most centrally located from different points in the city. Sometimes, too, students just have competing interests, and a selective high school may not have a football team or may not have an extensive arts program. Certainly with the statewide residential schools where kids actually have to live there, geography or sending your 14-year-old away to school might conflict with just practical realities at home or just cultural values that you have. So those are all things that the schools are considering.
I think it's important to keep in mind also that while this book focuses on public schools, there is a larger universe, and in that larger universe, in Washington, are schools like Sidwell, and Episcopal, and one thing or another, and the Cathedral School, and so a lot of youngsters, particularly those either eligible for scholarship support or from wealthier families, are also being creamed and going off to these institutions.
Okay. One of the reasons I like these schools is because they provide a kind of equivalent, in many cases, to a private education for families that could not afford the private education.
Yes.
Right. All right, so you raised this, that there's a debate here among the authors about whether or not we should create more of these kinds of schools. So Los Angeles, none of these schools. Denver, Seattle, Atlanta. Okay, big places that don't have exam schools at all, much less many suburban communities don't have anything like a Thomas Jefferson in their places. So let's talk through this a little bit. Why shouldn't we be encouraging other states and local communities to start up these kinds of schools? It seems like everybody would want a Thomas Jefferson or a school without walls.
Actually, they do exist in Los Angeles, and they do exist in Atlanta. They're just called something else, and they come in different garb. So in Los Angeles, you've got the Wildwood School, or in Atlanta, you've got Atlanta International, and these tend to be located in neighborhoods like Buckhead, and they tend to be private schools, and they tend to be and they tend to be the refuge or the educational option of the wealthy. And one of the nice things about creating these alternatives, as Checker has just pointed out, is that they are accessible to normal citizens who have normal incomes and on normal salaries.
So Jessica, why aren't you convinced that we should create some of these schools, say a public school in Atlanta that could play this role?
Sure. I shy away from recommending it wholesale for the same reason that in gifted education, which is my field, I would say, well, the gifted program is the answer, because oftentimes people misconceived that if you just assemble kids in a certain space or in a certain room, that in and of itself is what produces results, because those kids should just get to be together, when in fact we don't have any evidence anywhere in education that it's how students or grouped, or that they're grouped together, that makes the difference. It's actually what we do with them. So I go back to what I said earlier. If in gifted ed we use the would, could, should test from one of veterans in the field, Harry Passau. But is this, and I think the same test can be applied. Is this a school where things are happening that all or most other students, other than those who are here, would want to do or could do if given the opportunity, or should do because they're things that we know are best practice or well-researched approaches for all kids. Hands-on learning, concept-based approaches to instruction, systems thinking, those are all things that pretty much every curricular expert in general and gifted and special education advocates. So I'm for a school that does things that are qualitatively different, but not the kind of schools that simply say, okay, we're going to put all these kids over here, in essence, to keep the parents happy and just to give them all AP classes. I just don't think there's a policy justification for that.
Checker, would you like to argue with your co-author?
Yeah, to a degree, and there's a whole section in the book where we take 6 different points of view, from the governors down to the potential students, and essentially present the pros and cons from each of these levels: the governor's point of view, the superintendent's point of view, a principal's point of view, and so forth, as to whether you'd want to be in this school, whether you'd want to create one of these schools, whether you'd want to attend one of these schools. And I think we do a pretty balanced job of the pros and cons here. My concern is that if we leave the education of high-ability students to private schools and AP classes in general schools, we are going to lose a huge amount of talent that the country would benefit from developing better. They can't afford the private schools, and the sort of the AP alternative, while it certainly is the mass alternative, and we're not going to go away from it, and fine. But awful lot of schools that poor kids go to have just a few AP courses, or the AP class is full of kids who were not adequately prepared to succeed in it in the first place, or the teacher is not adequately prepared to really teach it. So the passing result in the AP exam isn't very good, even if the course is being offered. And in any case, there's 5 AP courses in that school, and a high-ability kid might be able to work at that level in a whole lot more courses and go beyond AP. One of the interesting things that a few of these schools, like TJ, is the beyond AP aspect of some of the curriculum. The 12th grade program for kids that have already done AP physics in 11th grade. In fact, at TJ, kids and parents were grumping that the 12th grade science course, which I believe is the Cosmos or something like that, some integrated science course, did not lead to another AP credit,
Right.
because the school had invented the course.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing that's in this book is that idea of completeness or wholeness. And so, Jessica, I agree with you. If all they're doing is the same old thing, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
But the opportunity you have in creating this kind of school is to create that completeness or wholeness. At whatever level you're able to do that, it makes a difference. And
Jeff, I'm curious. Has TJ been cloned by anybody? Has anybody come and tried to replicate?
Yeah, in fact,
Singapore has.
yeah.
I've seen that one.
we had all 14 sub-superintendents from Singapore in at various
But say
times.
something about that. Literally,
Yeah.
right? They've literally cloned TJ in Singapore.
Well, that's true. And but we purposely, very early when we created the school, created a consortium of magnet schools that now I'm not sure how many are involved, but probably 60 or 70. There were at least that when we did that, to purposefully be in the business of sharing best practices and ideas and creating the largest idea pool you can. And of course, we belong to every organization that would allow you to be a member, if you will, to begin to, as Stephen has said, you're looking for ideas everywhere, and particularly looking for ideas that are different from yours. Now, having said that, we did work hard in teacher training, and there are teacher training programs that continue Jefferson now that have been in place for 20-some years.
To train other teachers.
Well, in fact, there's a strong international program we created with the U.S. Department of State's Overseas Schools Division we bring 100 and some teachers a year to Jefferson from these overseas independent schools that are offering an American curriculum to, support business and our diplomatic efforts overseas. And so, and we learn from them, and that's a part of that idea of thinking larger and enlarging the students' understanding of the world around them.
Steve?
Well, I was going to say, if you were going to build additional schools, in answer to that question, one of the questions that follows is where, and I've given some thought to that, and I think I've got some proposals. I'm not sure they're answers. One is you build them proximate to and in cooperation with a university or
Absolutely.
a college, so that you get a multiplier in terms of resources. Secondly, I think schools of education, which this is not the place to unleash me on criticizing that part of American society, but I think increasingly, like medical schools, ought to be linked with hospitals. Ought to be. If it were up to me, I'd put schools of education, colleges of education, into public schools, and have the teachers living in the environment of a school. In any case, one of the opportunities you have is to improve a school of education by having a high school working with it. And secondly, I'd put them in marginal neighborhoods, not neighborhoods that were perceived of as Fort Apache necessarily, but in neighborhoods proximate to various socioeconomic groups, right, so that the less economically advantaged students would not feel they were going into alien territory to go to the school, and so that wealthy kids wouldn't feel that they were slumming in terms of going into the neighborhood of the school, and so I try to put them near affordable housing. So that there was this economic mixture as well.
It always comes back to real estate with you, doesn't it?
It does, as a matter of fact.
Mike, really quick, I want to point out that a lot of the schools on the list, and we didn't examine in depth the histories of all these schools, but they didn't start out as being academically selective. They were repurposed, so to speak, many of them. So maybe that speaks to the the economic justification. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to build a whole new school. It could be about repurposing a school, but there were a good number of schools that were that came about during the desegregation era as tools of desegregation and right, such. So it's most of these were not. It's like, oh, let's create an academically selective school, at least as far as we could tell.
You shouldn't underestimate, I think, also what's looking to the future, what online education is going to mean, not only for colleges and universities, but also for secondary schools. GW presently has an online high school, largely providing educational opportunities and courses for homeschooled kids, where the parents have some humility about their own capacity to educate their kids, and think it's useful to have them working with actual courses and teachers and things of the sort. Well, I think we're going to see more of that going on in conventional high schools going forward, and mixture of courses, and the universities and colleges, by the way, right, a mixture of a hybrid of courses, both taught physically in a specific place, but also distance learning.
All right, well, let's get the audience in here. We'll let you make one more
about
point.
Singapore.
Oh, good. There's lots of questions.
I wasn't kidding about Singapore. 8 or so years ago, some senior minister from Singapore visited Thomas Jefferson and came back to Singapore and said, we need one of those. And within 2 or 3 years, they had one, which I've actually visited. It's
right,
on the campus of the National University of Singapore, and it's a pretty impressive place.
They named it Erasmus Hall High School.
Okay, here in the front, Asa. So tell us your name and where you're from. And this is always, for in Washington, we always have to set these ground rules. Please ask a question. Don't make a speech. That's not a speech with a question mark at the end. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School.
Here.
Sorry. I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I want to ask about content, because as a professional, what I'm struck by is what's missing in the education, I would say, from K up, is process. I heard there was some systems, context, and consequences. I find this so devastating at this point in my life, I spend a lot of time with very bright kids. Everything is so soloed. When you talked about being holistic, I think it all has to be holistic.
Right.
I should also say John Dewey was my godfather and my mother's mentor.
Oh, wow.
So I come from a particular point of view.
Okay, let's talk about content
I had a
here.
life bust of John Dewey on my desk when I was principal at Chicago Lab School. But, well, the context is very much what we were about at Jefferson, of course. And I think that most of the schools who have been surveyed in the book are trying to create a larger context because, again, right up front you're going to cover the materials. The whole AP conundrum that we haven't talked about, is a problem. You have to change our model of education to make that happen. And that's probably one of the greatest values of having these schools is you can break free from that model of education we currently exist in. And so we have to step back from or at least understand that the testing idea has its limits. You can't measure excellence in schools on the basis of tests.
I think
So
it was.
line for me.
I was just going to say, because it's a John Dewey connection, I think it was John Dewey who said that which the best and wisest parent wants for his or her own kid, that's what we should want for all kids. So for me, I think to the extent that these schools can serve as a lab, a learning lab of sorts, to where they can experiment with things that then can be transferable to other high schools, which many people would agree are broken and are still functioning on very, very old ways of thinking about teaching, learning, in kids. They can extend that mission that you're talking about to all kids.
And I'm glad that you raised this question, but I think we should be, let me try to be provocative here. There's a line of argument, and I sometimes subscribe to it, that says we have to admit that kids come to our schools with very different needs and very different backgrounds and achievement levels, and that when you try to take the John Dewey approach, this goes back to Lisa Delpit stuff and other things, and you use it for kids who are coming from a low-income background, who do not have all those supports, who are coming in without the vocabulary, that it can be a disaster. And that we have to accept that schools that are teaching, say, high-achieving kids of any background are going to be able to look different and maybe use more constructivist, progressive methods than schools that are focused on kids who are coming in with a lot of educational deficits. I mean, Checker, do you want to address that? I mean, do you agree that these schools should be the model for everybody, or should we say, look, these schools' methodologies work because of the population they're serving?
Well, kids from disorganized home circumstances, limited vocabularies, and arrive in school without knowing the difference between a circle and a square are going to need some fairly basic instructivist instruction, in order to get to the point where the more appealing forms of teaching and learning are even going to be accessible to them.
I have to strongly disagree, but respectfully.
Yes, I love disagreement.
But respectfully
I was with you there,
disagree, because
Jessica.
I'm with school, in schools and with teachers every single day, and it's definitely not the case, to make an analogy, that you have to master dribbling before you play the game of basketball. Right. And all kids need high-level, meaningful kinds of instruction so that they, can catch up where they need to catch up. But if we use basic skills as the barrier to higher level thinking, we're going to disenfranchise a lot of kids. And maybe that's off our topic here, but I just had to say my piece.
We won't settle it today, but it's an important conversation. Okay, over here, Asa.
Hi, I'm June Fletcher, and I'm with the Center for Excellence in Education. And my question, we're talking a lot about creaming the best students. What about, do these exam schools cream the best teachers as well?
Actually, we do have some data. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. Compared with all public high schools, exam school teachers, 11% have earned doctorates.
Yeah.
And the comparison is versus 2% in all public schools. There's another. Let me just. I'm sorry. There's another point like that too.
A lot of the schools say that their teachers arrive with quite a lot of experience beyond public high schools. That is, university experience, corporate experience, other kinds of experience. We don't have any comparative data on that for what the normal, average, typical high school teacher has.
I think teachers with an earned master's degree but not a doctorate in exam schools, 66%, all public high school, 46%. Interestingly, and kind of along the lines of what you were just saying, Checker, for teachers who did not attend a traditional teacher prep program, the percentages are comparable. 16% of teachers in exam schools, that's the case for, versus 18% in public schools. So maybe because of industry.
So the question is on experience. What do we know about exam schools versus other schools for teachers?
We know that there's very little turnover in teachers.
Right. Yeah.
There's also just worth noting that the teacher-student ratio in the exam schools is just slightly worse than in high schools generally. Yeah. That is, they have slightly more kids per teacher.
Okay, let me remind our online audience that you can send questions to questions@edexcellence.net, or you can tweet them at #examschools. We have a question back here.
Hi, I'm Monica Warren-Jones with the D.C. State Board of Education, and one of the comments that just kind of resonated with me was when you mentioned that cheating was the biggest discipline problem. And I think it was last year in Long Island, there was a very big cheating scandal at a very prestigious public high school. In D.C., we tend to think of our big problems as being truancy. But as you think about these small schools and maintaining the integrity of the brand, if you will, how do you sort of assure the public, and what's the kind of the protocol for dealing with cheating at these schools and at the ones that you've observed in your study?
Well, the most important thing we did was try and change the assessment model to really understand that continuing to take high stakes tests was a very poor model for how you were going to validate anything you might know and understand. And so we really walked away from that kind of thinking about assessment and tried to come to something that, whether you call it authentic assessment or assessment in the work of the project and the problem you're working with, or group assessment, however you're looking at it, we wanted people to understand you needed feedback loops that were embedded in whatever you were doing that were causing you to get constant feedback rather than this idea of taking a high stakes anything.
Some things are easier to cheat at than other things, too.
Yeah.
The high-stakes tests, the plagiarism in a paper that you're writing. On the other hand, if you're creating a robotic wheelchair, one of the student projects I saw, it's actually hard to cheat and have it end up working.
But these answers, I have to say, make me a little disappointed that I'm not hearing anybody say, well, what about teaching ethics? To say that this is supposed to be a part of what we're teaching to our young people, is that cheating is wrong. Is there an effort in these schools? Did you see any of that? I don't know if that's happening in the schools you're affiliated with.
Well, I mentioned the whole idea around ethical culture and the work we had done with the National Endowment for the Humanities to really look at and understand how it plays out in your life every day, and certainly in the workplace. But I think, so let's look at plagiarism. When I write a letter now, there'll be at least 4 or 5 people who will read it with me several times and think with me about what it is we're trying to say, and clearly their ideas emerge in some of what goes out under my name, and vice versa. I hope that some of my ideas are emerging in work that they're putting forward, And so sometimes we draw lines that are really hard to understand and may not be appropriate in all cases.
Well, and I don't mean to diminish this concern about
Right.
cheating, but to add a note that many of the things we despair about today have actually been around for a long time, going well back into the day, which helps to explain the Ten Commandments.
That's a long time.
Well, I mean, so murder, for example, bad then and bad now, and so we've been teaching ethics in a manner of speaking for a long time, without actually getting to best practices, and I think the chances are we're going to have it. To some extent, people only cheat to achieve things they really care about. And so maybe it's a testimonial that we've made achievement in academic matters valued, and while we may have done so excessively, resulting in people behaving badly, there's still something to be said for it. I don't know. I mean, I'm still a little despairing about waking up this morning and discovering that Lance Armstrong has given up seven medals. His whole life, diminished as a result of his drug issues. But one sees it all around, whether it's Penn State or God forbid we look at what goes on Wall Street. Plagiarism and cheating of one sort or another seems to be part of the human condition. Mm-hmm. And while I don't approve of it, God knows, I don't think it's justify a total condemnation of our species either.
I think we also need to acknowledge that if you look across an education system of 55 million kids across the United States, that if cheating were the only discipline problem in that system, we would all be pretty happy. No guns, no gangs, no assaults, no truancy, all those other things that plague so many parts of the education system.
Okay, who is next? How about Susan here in the front row? Who, if I recall, was once the principal of an exam school?
Yeah.
Okay.
Susan Sclafani, now with Pearson on an education project. But I did run, going on 40 years ago, opened a magnet exam school. And so one of my questions is, we use something called the differential aptitude test, which gave us information on potential as well as actual skills. And we're able to take students who did very well in all of the reasoning areas and bring them in for a preschool workshop over the summer to get their skills up. Have any of the schools done that kind of outreach?
Illinois Math and Science Academy has a wide range of programs that are almost like readiness programs, and in the summer, I wouldn't call them pipelines to the school exactly, but they have them in the area where IMSA is located, and then at different places throughout the state, certainly in the city of Chicago. And the goal of those programs isn't just like to get kids to go to IMSA. It's just one of the things that IMSA does and needs to do actually by state mandate is to kind of take what they do and disseminate it in various ways across the state. So they have a summer institute like that. I don't know if TJ
Well,
does
the admissions
or not.
test at Jefferson is developed with components we buy from the Princeton operation, and they do correlational studies with different elements to try and tell us which elements are most effective in predicting success in the school. So they look at the scores on these various elements and then look at the grades at the end of 10th grade and try and develop the relationship and that guided us through several changes, as I mentioned, in the admissions test. But having said that, that's still a very poor model for how you would admit students. And so we were, as Checker points out, and Jessica in the book, looking beyond the test to see what other elements you could bring into that admissions process that would be more predictive of success.
Here's a related question from Edward Weber, the principal of the Cleveland School of Science and Medicine. And he asks, is it common for exam schools to offer tests in other languages? So that's interesting. I'm not sure if that means like English as a second language or entrance tests.
For admission?
This is the problem with our online audience. This is all I know.
We can't ask them for a clarification. I don't think we encountered it, but I don't think we asked specifically about it.
Okay. All right, who's got another question? Let's go on this side of the room. I'll come back to you in a minute.
Monica Herc, interested citizen. First, thank you for addressing this important and often under-addressed topic. My questions are, among kind of the more selective schools that you discussed, to what extent do they tend to be science and math schools?
Oh, okay.
And if that's true, that they're mostly science and math schools, then how is that addressing the needs of our gifted kids whose gifts may lie more on the verbal side?
Well, right here at the table, we have a science and math school in TJ and a humanities-oriented school in School Without Walls. Isn't that a fair statement?
I think it is, yeah.
The Townsend Harris High School, the one I mentioned in Queens, recreated a version of its classic pre-1942 curriculum and still requires you to take Latin or Greek as part of the curriculum in this public high school full of Asian kids in central Queens, studying Latin and Greek, at least for part of their curriculum. We saw a lot of STEM-type schools. There's no doubt about it, and it'd be misleading to say otherwise. But not all, by any means.
Yeah, I feel like, and I'd have to look at our actual list and then go through it. I don't think we did this for the book, but I feel like we had a lot more schools where it was just like global, a globalness. And a disadvantage of that was reported to us by students, teachers, and parents alike is, especially at schools where kids had to take all APs. You know, kids would say, you know, I guess I can take this, but I'm not interested in AP English, and like I got other stuff going on in my life. So that assumption that if you were talented in a certain in science, or you were verbally talented, that you should want to or have to take the highest, most rigorous, you know, course possible. I think a lot of kids and parents and teachers even felt kind of exhausted by that idea.
Okay, right here.
James Sang. I'd like to follow up on a comment that Dr. Hockett made, dismissing agglomeration effects or critical mass effects. I spent 37 years in a ridiculously academic field, physics, and you run into lots of New Yorkers. I graduated from one of New York special schools. Lots of New Yorkers who went to the special schools, and we all thought our teachers were all right, but as a group, we all thought that what made the school special was, in fact, that there were a lot of other smart kids around, and we thought that the chief advantage of these schools was a critical mass effect. You've dismissed it, and I'd like to challenge you on that.
Sure. I mean, just the peer effects research is not strong, but you know what is very, very strong in education is the impact of teacher expectations. So, you know, at a school like that school, or a lot of these schools that we went to, the teachers start with, and the kids start with the assumption that I'm going to be challenged here. These kids can do it. You've told me that these are smart kids, and that pervades the culture, and it influences what they do. So that's what I would argue is actually making the influence and creating that culture, not just the act of kids being assembled in a room or in a group within that room.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Asa?
Hi, good morning. My name is Sylvia Isaac, and I'm an assistant principal at School Without Walls. I'm here with Dr. George Reedy, who's a math teacher, and Carlton Ackerman, who's a social studies teacher. We've all been at School Without Walls for many, many years.
No turnover there. No turnover there.
Yes, we turned out. My question to the panel is, what strategies, communication would you suggest that a school like School Without Walls should have in place to convince, to persuade the community, the school system, that resources must be protected, maintained in order to prevent programs from being dismantled in the school?
This is, again, back to this resource question that, whereas some of these schools may not be more expensive, in a place like D.C. where there's a weighted student funding system, these smaller schools can certainly bear the brunt of some budget cuts when policies change. So what's the case? How do you make this case to the community?
Public opinion, I think, is very consequential in all public institutions. It's a matter of staying in touch with the media. It's a matter of making your case on a regular basis, so that the people who are going to be writing out the checks, whether it's the D.C. public school system, whether it's the city council, whether it's the mayor's office, have some sense that the eyes of the world are upon them, and that what they do is not only being observed, but is going to matter in the judgment about their own performance. Now, this is more daunting, I think, in some ways in the District of Columbia than in other places where some of our public servants don't seem to give a damn. But on the whole, I think that's good advice. And also it's a matter of keeping the other stakeholders involved, and I think therefore of the business community and of the parent community. You cannot underestimate the power of an angry mother.
Yeah, I was going to say both of those things. Maybe it was really important, I think, to have a partnership broadly in the community, and particularly with the business community. We benefited greatly from being a part of the Northern Virginia Technology Council, and George Johnson had pulled together the business and industry leaders out at George Mason University, and we sat on his council at the same time. And then this parent piece, we created our own foundation that was led by parents and put together, pro bono by parents, and in effect drove the idea of parent association, or PTA, to a higher level that recognized that we would need the same kind of support that universities were seeking in terms of doing their work or independent schools.
And it doesn't hurt to have influential alumni who can call up the mayor for whom they are the chief fundraiser or something like that.
Yeah.
And the quality of schools drive real estate values, and so I think that's...
There it is again. Can I suggest a topic for your next book, Stephen?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, can I ask a question before we close?
If it's quick.
What is Benno Schmidt and Chris Whittle's avenues going to mean for this whole agenda?
Yeah. Well, it charges $40,000 for starters, and so the number of poor kids who will be able to attend it in Manhattan will be limited by whatever the scholarship budget is of the school. I mean, it is very much a private school. The New York private school market, which hasn't opened a new upscale private school in 40 years, was just ripe to open a new upscale private school in, especially below 42nd Street, which is exactly what they've done. I don't think it's going to have any short-term effect. I think Stuyvesant will not be lacking qualified applicants anytime soon.
Okay. With that, we are going to close. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. You can go to Amazon.